Japan's stability wasn't an accident, it was deliberate engineering. I don't want to go to a restaurant where I'm served by a robot. The technology should facilitate those human connections, and we shouldn't be faceless, anonymous units. Inaction, in some ways, is the biggest risk. Who created Silicon Valley?
The businesses?
Well, no, the US government.
Welcome to the Breakaway Sequence. Today I'm joined by Johnny Schultz, co-founder and CTO of Tabelog Japan, the company that completely changed how people here make their restaurant reservations.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for being here. Johnny, you made now company a service that allows millions of people to make their restaurant reservations. But how did you come to this idea at the very beginning? What was sort of the trigger, the reason that you decided to enter this industry and digitalize the traditional way of reservations here?
Sure. Well, it's a great question. So in 2012, I was laid off from my previous job. So I was working in finance before as an algo trader. And I was laid off and I was looking for something to do. And I met the gentleman who became my co-founder, Yu Taniguchi. And so he and I were going out to restaurants, and we noticed that restaurants were, even though we had booked online, our name was written down in pencil and paper when we arrived at the restaurant. And so we thought, gee, that's odd. How does an online, we booked online, how does that become a manual, managed paper and pencil reservation? And so we started asking the restaurant managers questions and just sitting down with them and understanding their operations. And we found that they were getting reservations from 5 or 6 different online services. They were printing out all the emails for each reservation and they were copying them by hand. And the whole process took 2 or 3 hours a day of staff time. It had all sorts of mistakes, overbookings, underbookings. There was no way to really manage the tables. It was all just sort of guesswork. And so we thought, could we make a system that digitizes all of this, that firstly imports all these reservations and then gives you the tools to manage it. You can assign different customers to different seats. You can see who's pre-ordered what. And then we thought, okay, if we can do that, then we could also offer our own online bookings, and we could, basically come up with a better way for the industry to operate. And so 13 years later, we've grown it not just to, the actual management of reservations and customer data. To some degree, that's now table stakes, but we're doing marketing, we're doing payment processing, messaging, inbound tourism, connecting new channels of guests and helping the restaurants not only manage the guests they have, but also source new customers as well. And so, that's where we are. That's where we are today, and that's I guess the story of how we started.
Did your background help you a lot in this? If you were working in algorithmic trading company, you probably have some IT background related to that, or not necessarily?
Yeah, I'm an electrical engineer originally by training. In college, I worked in sort of a nanotechnology laboratory.
Oh.
I've always been interested in engineering and optimization, and I think there are some connections to algorithmic trading. Interestingly enough, one of the first ones is that when we were doing trading, it was very important to have a stable system, because as long as we were trading without bugs or issues, we would generally make money. But when an issue happened, we would lose a ton of money in a matter of seconds. I've seen as much as, in my company, the company I worked for, maybe I shouldn't get into specific numbers of losses, but a lot, more money than I've ever seen in my personal bank account, let's say. And when you look at the worst accidents in the industries, there's been, for example, Knight Capital is one example of a entire, firm that went bankrupt because of a software bug. And so you learn those lessons very quickly in that industry, how to build stable software, but also iterate very quickly because the markets are always changing. So, that's one of the first takeaways, is making a very stable system. And then, if we make a very stable system, then, my philosophy is everything, any good we bring to our customers, having new shiny features is always great. And everybody, of course, likes that, and the marketing people like that there's some new feature to go sell. But really, stability is the biggest feature. It's the foundation of everything we do. A system that's reliable, that people can trust, that they can log in, because these restaurant managers, they're running very critical and time-sensitive operations. And so if the system is having issues when it's lunch or dinner, that's a gigantic problem. So stability is I would say the first thing. And that's something that I really try to instill into my entire team when we're developing. So even with vibe coding and stuff like that, it's great, but it has to be stable. And using AI tools, for example, for testing is really a blessing. If AI enables more testing before we release, that's really, I think, what we're going for. The second thing that I learned, or that the second thing that I think I imported from algorithmic trading, in fact, what's really funny is we had a system at the company I worked, Lehman Brothers, and then Nomura. We had a system called Hydra. And what Hydra was it actually came out before, I think, Captain America, Hydra. It was a system that connected to, there's a bunch of different markets where you can trade stocks. So it's, in Japan we have Tokyo Stock Exchange, but there's also other
NASDAQ in New York, you mean that, right?
Yeah, so in the US, for example, there's a bunch of different venues that you can trade a stock. And usually there's one primary venue, like a stock would be listed on NASDAQ, but there's also off-exchange venues. There's what's called dark pools, where different finance firms will have their own sort of inventory of that stock that can be traded, or their own orders that can be traded against. So, sometimes you can get a better price if, rather than going to NASDAQ, you go to Goldman and say, hey, do you have anybody who wants to trade this stock?
So this is basically arbitrage of different
arbitrage is. Yeah, it's related to arbitrage in the sense that arbitrage is the act of, if there's misprices between one exchange and another, then you can arbitrage it by basically, buying low for one exchange, right, and selling high for another exchange. So there are people who do arbitrage between this, but usually it's more like this. So suppose on NASDAQ at any given time, there's the highest buyer and the lowest seller, right? So the bid and the offer, right? Price. And usually there's a spread, there's a gap between those two prices. And so, for example, if the highest buyer is bidding to buy at $80, and the lowest seller is offering to sell at $81, then the midpoint would be 80.5. Right? And so a lot of these off-exchange venues, for example, these dark pools, would allow a buyer and seller to both match at 80.5, which is a compromise price. So it's a better, if you're a buyer right now and you want to buy, and you go to the exchange, what's the price you can buy at right now? It's 81, right? It's the price that the best seller is selling at, right? So if you want to go buy right now, you have to cross the spread and you have to lift the offer, right? So you,
Right.
right? And at the same time, if you're a seller, it's the opposite. Even though you're offering to sell at 81, if you want to sell right now, you have to sell at $80, right? You have to hit the
so
bid,
that's
right?
why you meet in the middle.
That's why you meet at the middle. So it's a better price. It's a price that you can get done right now on your order, which is a better price than what's being shown on the exchange, is the idea behind it. And so that's roughly what dark pools do. And so the idea is that, I'm getting kind of into the weeds of explaining all this, but the idea is that when we talk about the ability to buy or sell stocks, that's called liquidity, right? So basically you want to trade where, if I'm a buyer, I want to trade in a market. I want to trade with all the different sellers that I can find, right? Because that's going to give me the best liquidity. If there's very few sellers, the sellers aren't competing with each other, right? Yeah, so the prices are worse, right? So this is the fundamental idea. And I think that there's an analogous thing that if I'm a restaurant, I want to be able to receive bookings from as many different channels as I
Possibly
can get.
Yeah.
So if I ideally, and then the thing is that these different channels will have different transaction costs, which is in restaurant terms, it's the price you pay for a customer, right? So you use these different booking channels, and in Japan we have, for example, Tabelog, EQ, Hot Pepper, Gurdurnabi, all these different booking sites are different channels. And so our philosophy is connect the restaurant to all these different channels, actually make it easy for them to receive reservations from all these different channels. At the same time, we offer our own reservations through our own platform, and when restaurants are on our platform, they actually don't pay us for those reservations if they come from us. So if they get a booking from Tabelog, they have to pay Tabelog. If they get a booking from EQ, they have to pay EQ. But if they're on Table Check, they're actually just paying us a fixed monthly subscription fee for our entire platform. And that includes not only the ability to get bookings for no additional charge, but also all the management tools that we provide. So the back-end customer management, table management, marketing tools. And we don't, for example, charge for user seats or anything like that. It's just charged per restaurant.
Eventually your offer is more cheap than competitors?
It's more economical for sure. What the competitors are offering is they're saying, hey, we have a critical mass of users using our service and we can help originate customers for you. In a sense, these other booking sites are advertising sites. I think what people don't realize about Table Check is people think, oh, there's Hot Pepper, there's Gurdurnabi, there's Tabelog, and then there's Table Check, and these are all just the same. Actually, no, we're radically different in our business model. So we are not a pure booking site. All the other sites are basically pure booking sites. And from their perspective, if you're a site like, this is really true for all of them, they're all what we would, using an industry term, call online travel agents. So it's really the same business model as Booking.com, or which sounds surprising, right? Because you think Booking.com does hotels and flights and and car rentals and stuff like that. So how could that be the same as restaurant reservations? Well, it's all the same thing at the end of the day. First of all, you're booking something, right? And Booking.com, by the way, owns OpenTable, which is the largest restaurant booking platform in the world. So the whole idea is these sites are making money off of the bookings. So their whole thing is, suppose I'm a car rental company like Hertz. If I get a booking from Booking.com, I have to pay Booking.com for that booking.
Right.
That's the fundamental thing, right? But not only that, there's the fact that I have to pay, and then also Booking.com will have salespeople knocking on my door saying, hey, not only do you have to pay for our platform, but also we want you to give a discount. So we want Booking.com to have the best price, And if you show a better price on booking.com, we can get you more customers because customers love a cheaper price.
Is it same with restaurant reservations?
Totally, it's the exact same thing.
Wow.
It's the same with flights, restaurant reservations, everything. So they say, okay, if you can give us a cheaper price on booking.com, we'll get more customers for you. Well, you're a schmuck at that point if you do that, because why not just show the best rate on your own site, and then you don't have to pay for it, right?
Right.
But it actually goes one step further. So not only are you paying booking fees, not only are you being pestered to offer discounts and marketing promotions on that platform, but the real kicker is, if you're it doesn't matter whether you're an airline, car rental company, hotel, or restaurant, in any of these models, it's all the same business model. The biggest thing is, if you get a booking from an OTA site, and I'm picking on booking.com, but we could put in literally any, Expedia or, you don't own the customer data ultimately. So you don't own the guest relationship. And this is changing a little bit now that there's been competition in the space, and there's been similar services, there's been Table Check and similar services that have kind of forced some of these OTAs to change their terms a little bit. But traditionally, so suppose you have a restaurant, right? Vitali's restaurant, okay? So as a restaurant owner, you want your guests to be loyal to you, right?
Correct.
So if Bob books at your restaurant, you want to be able to say, hey, Bob, here's, thanks for your visit. By the way, I see it's your birthday next month. If you come back for your birthday, I'll give you a free champagne, and
makes sense.
And so you have loyalty, and you're willing to give some discounts and stuff to retain guests and stuff like that. Well, the OTA sites, the online travel agents, don't want you to be able to do that, because what they want for their perspective is Vitali's just another restaurant. If Bob books at Vitali's restaurant through our platform, what we want to do is we want to say, hey Bob, use OpenTable or whatever service it is, use our OTA service again. And by the way, if you like Vitali's restaurant, you'll love his competitor, Joe, which is a similar restaurant. Try Joe's restaurant next time. And so they want to churn the guests, the diners, whoever. This is the same for hotels or whatever. They don't want to encourage brand loyalty. They actually want the opposite. They want to churn those guests through as many different restaurants on the platform.
They want to encourage their brand loyalty.
They want the guests to be loyal to them, and they say, by the way, Vitali, you cannot reach out to Bob directly according to our terms of use. That's forbidden.
Wow.
And because we own that relationship, and Bob is just an anonymous, he fills a seat for you, but that's it. That's where it stops. And so that actually makes your business model much less sustainable. So let's look at the economics now. So if you're a restaurant, you want to have a good location. So you're spending probably 30% of your top line revenue on real estate, right?
Right.
And then you want to have good food. So you're spending probably if you're a high-end restaurant, you're probably spending 30%, 20, 25, 30% on ingredients. And then you have to pay your staff. So that's another 30% for your staff. And so when you add all this stuff up, really, you're only left with really a 10% margin on.
At best, probably.
Yeah, and then if an OTA comes in and says, hey, we want 8 or 10% of your revenue just to get you a booking, and by the way, that person is not going to be able to actually be loyal to you, right? So then you're left with basically nothing. And that's what these OTAs exactly want to do. They want to basically bleed these businesses for as much of that extra margin they can while still keeping them on life support. Kind of like a vampire who leaves just enough blood for their victim to survive, to not die. They don't want the restaurants to die ultimately, but they want to suck all the margin out of the industry and capture it for themselves. So for our business, we looked at this and we said, so the first thing I said is, wow, you really have a management problem. First of all, you have a problem with managing the data, just trying to use all these different channels. But more than that, once we solve the management problem, you have an even bigger problem, which is a problem of revenue and margin, right? It's a problem of profitability. And it's a problem of ownership of data and therefore ownership of your business. And so I think that looking at the problem looking at from the operational side of just managing the reservations was one thing, but when I started to really understand how the industry operates, I really said, gee, that's not good. It's not a model that is going to lead to wonderful restaurant experiences. It's not a model that is going to allow restaurant owners to really own and benefit from their business. I mean, if I was a restaurant owner and I worked for a long time, of course I love to cook and love my customers, but if I'm not making any profit off of it, if I'm not fundamentally in control of my business, after a certain number of years I would just say, screw this. I'm not going to do this anymore because I'm not getting anything out of it. Because I'm trapped inside a system where it's impossible for me to win. And so that's what I think that our business fundamentally is about, is changing that whole paradigm on its head. And so what people don't realize is, like, when you actually book on TableCheck versus Tabelog, or not just Tabelog, EQ, or any of these other sites, the restaurant is getting more benefit from you using TableCheck. And it's not something that we really put in our branding because we don't really know how, we don't, at the end of the day, it's not a charity per se.
Right.
But it's something that I think consumers don't really understand. But really what we are doing is advocating a model where rather than a monolithic storefront that owns everything, it's very much a distributed, decentralized model where each restaurant is owning its own data. And we're really just trying to be sort of a marketplace where everyone can operate, but we're not trying to be a middleman where we're fundamentally inserting ourselves between the guest and the restaurant, right? So if you think OTAs, if you have the guest in the restaurant, right, OTAs want to be the gatekeeper.
Yeah.
They want to say, hey, guest, you're walled off. You can go to the restaurant, but you're kind of walled off from a direct relationship, and we're going to tell you who to go to next, right? And similarly, they want to wall off the restaurants from the guests. We don't want that. We want a world where it's what we call dining connected, a world where the restaurants and the guests are directly connected. And we're just the technological foundation or substrate that facilitates that interaction. Just like a telephone facilitates two people calling, that some level of technology and infrastructure is required. But it's a question of, as soon as your telephone starts telling you who you can talk to, maybe in, some totalitarian, maybe North Korea it's like that, but that's not what we want.
Yeah, the thing that you described, it's sort of shocking, and how did you even sort of come up with those conclusions initially? Did your co-founder help you maybe with that, with research, with?
Yeah, he had been working in this industry for 2 years before I really joined up and did this.
What's his background?
He was originally, prior to TableCheck, he was doing credit card processing. He worked at a Visa subsidiary, and then he had done a startup in Japan where he wasn't one of the founders, but he was a quasi-founder. He was one of the first employees, and that gave him a lot of experience in kind of how to do startups. Yeah, he came with a lot of ideas, but I really think it was he and I together sitting down at a whiteboard and really mapping things out. And if we were to go back to that room 13 years ago, Actually, it's an apartment just a block or so away. It's not, you saw our old office, but there's our old office if you go one block further. So it's all, our office has always been in this corner of Ginza in Tokyo. But in the original, our first office was an apartment actually that had a shower. And originally, when we were just a startup, we actually had one of our first employees. One of the conditions of his thing is, okay, we can't pay you a lot of salary because we don't have any money, but you can sleep in the office if you.
Employee benefit.
Yeah, exactly. It was sort of an employee benefit. As soon as we got our first female employee, we kind of realized, okay, we can't come in at 10 a.m. and have this guy, in his underwear cooking breakfast or whatever anymore. So we had to stop the sleep in office benefit at that point. So anyway, at that old office, we sat down in front of a whiteboard. Actually, it might even be the same whiteboard we have here. And
you mean exactly the same?
I don't know. Maybe it's not. Maybe we've gotten a new whiteboard since then. But I don't know if a whiteboard lasts 13 years. But anyway, we sat down and we mapped out the industry. We said, look, if we make a service that does this, and then we launch our booking feature, we launch this, here's how the different OTA services are going to react. And we kind of mapped out this kind of dance that would take place of, okay, we're going to get more customers. At some point, they're going to try to launch a competing, what we call TableCheck as a table management service. They're going to launch their own competing TMS. Actually, all of that has kind of played out exactly, remarkably close to how we predicted 13 years ago. And I think we're now at a point where, at the time we started our business, the largest sort of TMS system in Japan, table management system, was OpenTable from the US. And it was an on-premise system. You had to buy their hardware and have it installed that they maintained. So if your machine went down, it was basically a Windows box, but it was provisioned by them. You had to have their computer box in your restaurant. And so we were actually one of the first cloud-based services 13 years ago to offer a table management service on the cloud, actually worldwide. We just happened to be, I think had we started our business just a year or two earlier, we might have considered it as an on-prem system. But it just coincided with the fact that in 2013, Amazon Web Services was getting critical mass. I'm not even sure that Azure had been launched by that time. In fact, I don't think it had been. Or Google Cloud was maybe just starting. But so it kind of coincided with the rise of the hyperscalers. And so, one of the things that actually was a big benefit early on was to be able to go to OpenTable customers and say, well, you don't have to buy more hardware. You can just switch from their box to be a cloud model. And it actually worked well at the time. That was a bet we made. And of course, now in hindsight, it's an obvious thing that everything is cloud-based SaaS. But at the time, that wasn't necessarily obvious.
Was this innovation hard to sort of justify and explain to the restaurant owners? Because from what you said, probably they were already, or many of them were already digitalized. So it wasn't like a question of whether or not to use some software, etc.
Well, they were not digitalized.
They were not.
Yeah, in fact, so at the time we started, OpenTable had around 2,000 restaurants. 1,000 to 2,000 restaurants in Japan,
okay,
using their on-premise system that also allowed online bookings. Their on-premise one connected to at some point they had a cloud, service it connected to that handled the book, the web-based bookings, but that was more of a module than And so there was 2,000 restaurants on the platform, and people said to me, well, you're crazy for starting this business because OpenTable exists and you're never going to be able to compete with them. And also I thought, well, gee, if I could just get to 2,000 restaurants, then I'm just set for life because that's more than I'll ever need. So fast forward 13 years later, we're at 14,000 restaurants today on our platform.
All in Japan?
No, not all in Japan. Maybe 2/3 of those are in Japan.
Are you currently bigger than OpenTable in Japan?
Oh, well, OpenTable has exited Japan. So
Oh.
they're at zero. So in Japan.
Do you think it's because of you? You sort of destroyed them, or there were other reasons?
Well, I would say it's probably more apt to say that they destroyed themselves.
Oh.
On multiple levels. They made so many mistakes. And if anyone from OpenTable is watching this, I mean, this is all water under the, it's all old news now. But they made so many mistakes that it was shocking to me to watch. But I think that being a US company, the fundamental thing was they just didn't care about Asia. It just wasn't. In fact, I knew their CTO at the time, and I knew their VP of engineering. And I'd actually flown out to San Francisco to meet them. And at the end of the day, they just, they were aware of the kind of things that they needed to do to defend the Japan market. And they just said consistently every single time, we could have our engineers work on this thing for Japan, and that might get us 500 more restaurants in Japan and defend the ones we have. Or we can spend those same engineers in the US market and we can get another 3,000, 4,000 restaurants. So it was always economics leading them to expand in the US. And they did continue to grow to the largest, they maintained their dominance and their position in the US as the largest restaurant booking service there. So yes, they lost the battle in Japan, but they also did very well in winning the overall war. Maybe they were fighting in the US market, and that's what they cared about.
Japan wasn't just the priority for them.
No, they're a US company at the end of the day. And Japan is so idiosyncratic in its customer needs and the way it operates that they just, everything they did for the Japan market was always an afterthought, rather than for us, it was a, it's like we're like a native species to this, thing, so we can adapt ourselves directly to the Japan market. And it's the case when we go to other markets like Taiwan and compete with companies there. We do very much in terms of localization of our system. We support 22 languages in our platform. We connect to all the local channels. But fundamentally, we have to compete with services in other countries that, are only doing that country. So when we go to Korea, there's a company, Table, for example, that only does Korea. And that, they say, we're never going to expand outside of Korea. We just don't care to. Whereas for us, it's like, we're a global system. And it's actually one of our key goals is that we actually are able to offer our system everywhere, that it could be used at a restaurant anywhere on the globe. And that, when we make features, we think about, okay, how is this going to interact with all the different payment gateways in every country, right? We support about 10 different payment gateways because every country in Asia needs its own payment gateway. It's not like Europe where you just have EU regulations and you can just use Stripe or ADN or those kind of platforms, right? That's kind of a one size fits all. In Asia, you actually have to connect to every thing, and then for text messaging, we have to connect to local services for that, or messenger channels, right? We have to connect to not only WhatsApp but like Yalo in Vietnam, for example, if we're going to be in Vietnam.
Would you say that market differences make the biggest challenge for you for expanding here in Asia, or?
Well, I don't. Yeah, let me start with Japan and just kind of go back to the OpenTable thing and just give an example real quick. So one example I always give in the early days was we'd go talk to OpenTable customers, right? And we'd say, okay, look, OpenTable's been building their system for 10 years, has all these features that, are we going to be able to deliver this for you in the next 3 months or 6 months to being as sophisticated in every feature that they have? No. We just have me and a few other guys we hired, but we're not going to be able to build an as sophisticated, we're not going to be able to match 10 years of dev time in 3 months.
You mentioned that reliability is very important, but often people say that when launching company, launching startup, you just have to go with whatever MVP barely working that you have.
I think that's wrong. I mean, especially in Japan, maybe in the US, maybe, but in Japan, that's a losing strategy for sure. Yeah, Japan stability is so important because it comes down to customer trust. And I think everyone is willing to tolerate 1 or 2 F-ups, but if the system is still going down, I mean, at some point it's going to become just a simple thing like, okay, look, we need to run a restaurant here. If your system is going down during peak hours, there's certain things we can do to mitigate it, like we can print out our guest list beforehand, so if your system does go down, we're covered. But at some point it's going to become a conversation of, look, we just can't, your issues are causing a business loss for us. And I think that this is something that I've, working even with mature US companies as our vendors, I've said the same thing. It's like, in fact, one time I heard this from a guy at a vendor. There was a vendor customer advisory board I went to, and he looked at that. He was a customer of that vendor, and he looked at them and he said, look, you guys are having too many issues, and you need to understand that when my company has an issue and it's our own fault, it was a game company. When we have an issue and our video game goes off, our cloud, multiplayer game goes offline, and it's our own fault, it's like, it's not good, but it's okay because we know that we fucked up. Pardon my, you can bleep that out. we know that we messed up. But when
service provider,
when you as our service provider causes our system to go down, that's not okay because we have no control over it, right? And so that's very much, I think, that as a service provider, you need to realize it's the same thing with a restaurant, right? If a restaurant makes a mistake where it was their own staff, got the guest's name mixed up or got, failed to write down something on the phone, whatever mistake they made, and it's their own fault, it's like, that's on them. But if it's somebody they're trusting and paying as a third-party service, they're not gonna tolerate lots and lots of issues, right? I mean, if it happens once in a blue moon, I mean, and honestly, the times that our system has gone down, I mean, in recent memory, in recent years, every time it's been because of a third-party service in a way that we're going to extreme lengths to insulate ourselves from.
So like Cloudflare failure or Amazon service.
Yeah, and we don't even use Cloudflare, so we weren't affected by that. And I've always seen Cloudflare, I've just seen it as another point of failure. And even Amazon outages we've managed to tolerate, because
How? What do you mean you manage?
well, one of the things we're lucky that we're not on their US instance. Had all our infrastructure been on the US instance, then it would have been a problem. But increasingly we're now getting our own data center hardware, our own hardware running in a data center in Tokyo, that hopefully, in the future we have kind of what we're really going for is a hybrid cloud where we have our own hardware plus Amazon provisioned, Kubernetes nodes, basically in a hybrid Kubernetes cluster that combines, from a provisioning perspective, it combines it in somewhat of an opaque manner. It's not exactly opaque, but basically we can have a Kubernetes cluster that spans both Amazon's capacity and our own capacity. So we can use our own hardware to handle the base load, and when we need to scale, we use Amazon for to add in more dynamic nodes.
So in theory, it should be much more reliable, while still being scalable.
I mean, we're still exposed to, at that point now, we're exposed to the fact that a disk or some hardware could fail in our own cluster,
like
right?
Literally, physically,
And we're more piloting that with our staging environment. We have seen those failure modes, of course, and we're using, we're not at the point where we're rolling that out fully to production yet, but we're getting there, and we're using our staging environment as a learning experience to ultimately get there. And then it's also cheaper. I mean, one of the things we're most affected by is the weak yen, and the fact that we have to pay Amazon in dollars, right? And so for us becoming ever more cost efficient, I think a lot of these innovations around running our own hardware, and now it's actually about running our own AI. We just bought a bunch of DGX Sparks, to run. We're buying GPUs of various kinds to run models on.
What exactly do you use AI for?
Well, I mean, increasingly a lot of things. So first of all, we have AI features incorporated into our products today. So not only do we sell the management not only do we sell the table management package, which allows you to see which guest is at what table or do marketing and stuff like that, but also we sell an analytics platform as well. That if you're a major, our clients include the largest hotel, pretty much name large major global hotel brand, Hilton, Hyatt, Intercontinental. They're using our product at all their restaurants in Asia, most of them at least, for many of these brands. And so we sell a product that allows them to analyze revenue and analyze customer trends across all of their restaurants in the region. And so this has, for example, forecasting features. It has even the ability where you can go and say, it's a BI tool at the end of the day, business intelligence tool. And you can go in and you can say, hey, show me a graph of all the OTA bookings I'm getting, and how much revenue they're bringing in, compare the revenue between them, yada yada. You can actually just type that in as a make me the dashboard, and then we have AI today that will
generate
the whole thing for you. Yeah, and one of the reasons for doing AI in our own cluster is that it unlocks the ability for us to use AI with customer data. With end customer data. So the restaurant's end customer data, if they want to use, if we have some AI that wants to do analysis of actual customer data, we don't have to worry, for example, that phone numbers or names will go to AI, because it's never leaving our ecosystem, right? It's entirely self-contained on our own servers. So those kind of things aren't possible if you're talking to, if you're using Anthropic or OpenAI as your AI provider, because according to SOC 2, you're not supposed to let those things leave your data environment. And it would be a bad thing to do, because if customer data gets, involved, it could potentially be used for training. Now, they say they're not doing that, but can you really trust that, right? I don't think anybody believes that. And so not only does this allow us to use AI for customer-facing applications, but also for our own internal staff as well, that we can go to our staff and say, hey, you don't have to think about what you put in the AI engine, because it's all self-contained. It's all, there's no way that this data ever leaves the cluster. When we're running models on our own GPUs, it never phones home, right? So I think that's an important thing to do now. I think going into the future, it's going to become even more important. I think the other thing...
You mean data security?
Well,
is
yeah,
gonna be
yeah.
even more important?
Data security starts by fundamentally, if you never put your data into a third party, that's the most secure
Yeah,
thing,
you're right. That
right?
makes sense.
You
Yeah.
can't get more secure than zero, right? In fact, when we look at, we've had some peer companies that have actually had major data leaks. I mean, hundreds of millions of records, customer records leaked. And the way that it's happened is often they've said, well, hey, we weren't hacked. What we did was we had a contract with some third-party provider, and we put that data on their FTP server or whatever, we gave that data to them in some form. I don't know if it was FTP or how it was transferred, but we gave it, and then they were hacked. And it's like, what do you think clients think? Do you think clients are like, oh, okay, well, if it wasn't you guys who were hacked, if it was just...
Yeah, they don't care.
They don't care,
You have
right?
to figure out,
Yeah.
You are the one to blame, so.
And so that's something I'm always, and so I think that, I talked about stability as a pillar of what we do. Data security and security in general is a second pillar, right? That, again, it's the foundation of everything that you do. And so I had the 3 S's. I had stability, security, and I had one other. And I haven't had enough coffee today, so I don't remember what it was.
Sustainability.
Could be, yeah. That would
Not
work.
in environmental terms, but like in business, sustainable business.
That could very much be one. Yeah. Oh, I think it was solvency. Solvency. Yeah, which is basically is the same as sustainability for your business. Basically, especially for us, it's very difficult to raise money in Japan, more so than other. And this kind of maybe segues to a conversation for advice for Japan startup founders. My first advice is think really hard if Japan is really the market you want to do. Just because the VC ecosystem is just, it's just not Silicon Valley. And this is probably true for any country or any ecosystem
That is
not
not Silicon Valley. Yeah.
But I think, where are you from originally?
I'm Ukrainian.
Ukrainian, okay. Well, Ukraine if you're a defense startup right now, Ukraine actually might be a very good place to do it. Big respect for what's going on in Ukraine for sure, and all the ingenuity and entrepreneurship that's literally saving the country right now. It's pretty incredible to watch.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, places like Estonia, for example, are also innovation hubs.
Yeah, that's a big tech hub in Europe.
That's managed to that's managed to come up with an investment ecosystem and ultimately give access to capital to founders. I mean, Israel's is another startup.
Yeah, but in Estonia, the government, they did a lot of reforms to attract foreign businesses. They have very great system for, I think it's called e-residency for...
Yes. And same in Israel, by the way. And so and Silicon Valley, who created Silicon Valley?
The businesses?
Well, no, the US government. And specifically, and you can read the whole history about this, and actually not just the US government, but the defense industry specifically created it.
How exactly?
Well, it was, and I don't know the exact year, but I think after World War II, they said, okay, we need to, we realize that America's world dominance is going to come from technological dominance. And so we need to create an innovation engine. And how do we do that? It's going to come from getting the smartest people we have and getting bright kids from universities like Stanford, for example, and getting them all in one place, and then giving them access to capital to found companies that will then become big companies and will stay in that area and continue to invest in the ecosystem. So it creates a positive feedback loop of innovation, right? Capital, pumping capital into innovation, which creates more capital, which can be invested back into the system into a feedback loop.
Well, I genuinely thought that it was sort of like organically developed place, not some government plan.
No, it was not an accident. I mean, was there serendipity that worked in its favor along the way? Yeah, sure. But no, it wasn't an accident at all. It wasn't just a bunch of hippies got together and, Steve Jobs guys and, smoking a bunch of grass and then decided to build computers. It's like, no,
not like that.
It's not an accident. And this goes back to places like there's a lineage from places like Bell Labs and stuff into Silicon Valley. So there's books written on this, and I don't know the full history. I'm not an expert in this, but it's clear that in America's case, and I think the cases that like Estonia or other nations that are trying to replicate this, you need some government. Whether it's in the form of tax breaks or regulation or some incentives or whatever it is. You need that, the government thing can very much help that go along. And I just don't see that Japan is forward looking in this manner. I mean,
why do you think it is here that way? And not only here, like many people tell it about Europe. I mean, besides Estonia, many countries in Europe, they have sort of like not that well developed startup ecosystems. Is it like not reproducible what happened in the US?
No, I would argue that it's probably reproducible, but you have to be willing to, firstly, you have to be willing to take a risk of failure. That's one of the biggest things.
Yeah, the cultural differences.
And
probably.
So it's not enough just to pick an AI startup and give them some money. I mean, that's kind of what this ends up being in a lot of countries. It ends up being, we want to invest in a startup ecosystem, and then it just turns into just kind of corruption is a strong word, but capture, where some AI company just gets some insane subsidy to do something that's ultimately not of sustainable value. I mean, the stuff going on in Japan, it's like, okay, investing in some podunk, AI education company is not going to create the next Anthropic. We were just talking about how, we talked about kind of the history of Silicon Valley, about how it wasn't an accident per se, and sort of what it looks like when countries try to replicate their own Silicon Valley, right? So we talked about Estonia and Israel as, I would say, examples of it actually succeeding. I think that and we talked about basically, you have to fundamentally have a tolerance for risk. So,
culture-wise, or
well, both. But I think you have to have a cultural risk appetite to start. And we look at Ukraine, for example. I mean, they have to have a risk appetite, right? Because it's do or die. Literally, it's literally do or die. And so, that will very quickly create an environment where you're not just concerned about locking in progress on half measures that don't win the battle, right? I mean, if a company, if you think about suppose a Ukrainian lab produced a drone doesn't really fly, but it looks like it might fly if they keep developing in 3 years. It's like you don't have 3 years. You don't have 3 weeks.
You don't have another shot at all.
You don't have another shot. And so it's like you very quickly, and I think that you see this in the VC ecosystem in Silicon Valley, where a VC will invest its money into, let's say, 10 companies. 10 is a low number, actually, but let's say they invest in 10 companies. They expect that 9 of those companies will fail and that 1 will maybe be a home run. And that 1 home run, if it can return 100x,
it will cover everything.
It will cover everything, right? And so that's really the mindset they have, versus investing in 10 companies and expecting them all to be
a little good.
Yeah, mediocre, maybe they double, but they don't, but we'll do whatever we can to prevent them from failing, right? Because failing is an embarrassment, right? And I think that's one of Japan's major flaws.
So you mean like in proper Western, like let's say United States VC strategies, it's either great success or simply failure, and in Japan they are trying to do this, they would rather have 10 mediocre businesses than
Yes.
9 failures and 1 great business.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the case, and I think that's very much the VC mindset. In fact, we've had VCs that, this company was doing a previous business model, and we had investors that we went to, and we pivoted into the current model. So this is actually, when I joined, it was part of the pivot, basically. And I count myself as a founder, but strictly speaking, I joined 2 years after the company was founded. And I bought in.
Table check?
Yeah, I basically bought into the company, right? So it's like Elon Musk is a founder of Tesla. Did he actually start Tesla?
Yeah.
No, but he bought into it and he's led the company, right? So that's effectively what I've done with Table Check on some level. And I bought in at a time when the company was worth almost nothing. I mean, it had investors, and those investors. Basically, when the company was clearly failing, so the original thing my co-founder who started the company tried to do with the entity, that actually it wasn't called Table Check in those days, it was called Vesper, was the name of the company.
Vesper.
We renamed, so when we pivoted, sometime after we pivoted, we renamed the company to Table Check. And again, this is quite common.
So your initial strategy was a little different from what you do now, right?
Yeah, the initial strategy was, this wasn't what I was involved in, but the initial strategy that they launched and that they raised capital for originally was a sort of like a Groupon, like a flash marketing site, but aimed at the luxury consumer segment. So for example, it would be a deal where, okay, you could buy a bottle of Opus One wine, but rather than paying $400 a bottle, it only costs you $300 a bottle.
How does it go? Like, how do you cut this 25% of the price?
Well, the wholesale price of Opus One is probably much lower, and so there's some distributor who's willing to give a discount. But it wasn't just wine; it could be other luxury goods. It could be jewelry, or it could be a nice. In fact, this is how the connection to the restaurant was a dinner at a high-end restaurant would be 25% off, but and the reality, what probably was happening was that high-end restaurant actually was having problems fill its seats. So it wants a marketing channel where it can actually do those kind of discounts, because it would much rather make 75% of the money rather than lose all, basically have an empty seat, right? And so they had a network of various luxury lifestyle type, and it could be resort stays or whatever it is, right, that they were offering discounts. The problem with that premise was very simple. If you're willing to buy a bottle of wine for $300, you probably don't care about paying $400. Like, it's just not something where the people who are going out and buying wine for that much are shopping around for the best absolute price on that wine, right?
Yeah, so basically the wrong assumption was that sort of like luxury buyers are price conscious.
Yeah, yeah.
Which now sounds ridiculous, but probably.
Yeah, and yeah, you're not looking to earn points or whatever when you're buying, these kind of things. In fact, luxury buyers, in some ways, many cases, you look at Chinese luxury buyers, they want to be able to show that they spent it's not the thing that they bought, it's how much money they spent, and the more money they spend is better, right? So, it's just, when you hear they bought a $10,000 bottle of champagne for New Year's, it's not the champagne that necessarily tasted good, it's the fact that they spent the money, right?
Right.
So anyway, the premise was flawed. And so at some point they went to investors and they said, hey, we want to buy, in fact, part of me coming in is say, we want to buy our shares back in order to do a new business model. And, we're sorry that this didn't work out. We tried our best, but it just ain't working. The investors said, no, we'll invest more in you as long as you just don't stop doing what you're doing, even though we know it's failing. Because we don't want the investment to be written down. We don't want to lose out on the investment, right? We don't want to lose face that we failed in our investment. So we're willing to pay, which sounds ridiculous.
It does,
that you would do this.
Yeah.
But when you think about if your priority is to not lose face as an investor, and not, if having a loss is a catastrophic thing, then you're willing to actually pay money in order to avoid that embarrassment. And I think that sort of thing is in Silicon Valley. I mean, it's just when an investment's not working, they give it a try, but at some point they just say, the companies, there's just a realism, say, okay, we'll just take a write down. And you get a tax break for it too. So, you get, at least you can offset your gains with your losses, right? This is something that apparently Donald Trump lost a lot of money in various business things, but he always took write downs. So he was able to, when he actually did make money, he basically paid no taxes because he had lost so much money up to that point in failed casino ventures or whatever, right? And so, the system is set up that there is some consolation prize for losing. But I think that mindset needs to fundamentally change. I think there's a couple things that, the flip side of that is, look, the bigger context is Japan's population is shrinking. Right. Okay, so that's the macro picture. And so then there's a view that the whole market is, and maybe this will change with AI, I don't know. AI is definitely a potential to change Japan's long-term prospects here to some degree.
Maybe not just AI, but specifically robotics with AI. So many jobs that would require just a lot of human physical force that they would get.
Well, I would actually say no, the other way around. I mean, I think that in some ways the jobs that only humans can do, we don't necessarily want to be replaced by robots.
But I mean, Japan has some very unnecessary jobs, like people who work as a sign. I don't know if you noticed that, but
yes.
You don't see it in other countries.
They have robots for that, by the way.
You have sticks for that,
Well, no. There's a literal. There's a sign that's it's like a cutout of looks like a cartoon guy going like this to wave, traffic.
I got it.
And then there's a guy standing next to that sign, and he asks this guy, "What's your job?" I'm just standing here in case the robot breaks down.
Yeah, that was a cultural shock for me because
Right. Well, yeah, sure. So there are bullshit jobs, as we can call them, in any economy that are just there to basically
to give job to
give their jobs for the sake of giving people jobs. Yeah. Sure. As the population shrinks, maybe the amount of those such jobs will contract. But I would say that there's certain jobs that are irreplaceable. So, for example, a restaurant server. I don't want to go to a restaurant where I'm served by a robot. Like it's
But
just.
there are many self-service restaurants, some fully automated or like almost fully automated.
But a nice restaurant, if you're going on a date with your girlfriend,
You're right.
do you want to take her to a place where you're served by? I mean, unless she's really into robots. Yeah, there's Heidi Lau, and there are fully automated restaurants, yes, and that's in some ways a novelty experience for what it is today. And maybe that model will go from less being a novelty, but maybe McDonald's will be fully automated. And if it's McDonald's and you're just there to literally get food to shove into your mouth,
let it be, like it's okay.
maybe it works for fast food and quick service restaurants. But I think at a certain tier, when you go to a restaurant, right, it's not just about the food, but it's about the overall experience, and it's about the atmosphere. And your server is part of that, experience. Now, will that evolve to some degree? Yes, but I don't see that. I don't see the job of restaurant server or chef going away anytime soon.
But this is quite different. Like chef, first of all, it would be probably more difficult to automate because it
depends on what you're cooking.
Yeah, you're right, but like if it's high-end restaurant, like again, the processes that you do, they often are very sophisticated and they require a lot of sort of feeling into it, like human stuff.
Well, that's right, and it's it's just like. Think about performers, right? Actors, is Tom Cruise going to be replaced by a robot or CG? No, or play actors, stage actors, or, street performers or whatever it is. Like, if I see a street performer juggling, that's impressive. If I see a robot juggling, it's like, okay, great. This robot has been hyper optimized to juggle, cool, but it's not as cool as a person doing it in my book. It's in other words, it's a different experience.
Do you think that now with AI and automation, the robotics coming everywhere, do you think people like street performers and just overall performers, they are going to have basically the renaissance of sorts, epic comeback because people would be just tired and not interested in AI slop or in, as you said, robots juggling, and now everybody will start to appreciate more?
I don't know about that. It's just a different category at the end of the day. Watching a robot do something, like a robot, one of those robots that does backflips or whatever,
right.
Or, it's like, imagine in the Olympics we had robots competing against people in the 100-meter, sprint. It's like, well, of course the robots are going to win, right? And
right.
It's a different category. And so it doesn't, for example, make the Olympics irrelevant because we can make humanoid robots that are better, faster than humans, or harder, better, faster,
with chess, that's what's happened, because once computer beat, I think it was Garry Kasparov.
Sure, yeah.
They just stopped doing computer versus person competition, but person versus person competition.
Well, I guess it basically, it creates a different category, and that's okay. Any competition, difficulty comes from the fact you're in a category. And I think that, let me put it this way, look at men's athletics versus women's athletics, right? We could pick any sport, whether it's, boxing, we could pick running, we could pick tennis. Men's bodies are, this is a controversial thing to say, but biologically, men's bodies have more muscle, more bone density, and are just basic. When we talk about competition as a way of measuring performance, the numbers for men come out higher, right, or faster, whatever it is. And so men are a separate category than women, right? And the reason why we don't put women and men in the same sprint, for example, is because the people who fall into the male category would always win, and the women would just like literally never win. I mean, short of all the men tripping or something like that, or so short, it would be a once in a blue moon event, right? And so that would basically make the competition not interesting, right? It would make it not fair and not fun. So now let's add, we have men, women, and now we have robots. Well, the robots can outperform the humans in running, or, we could do it as robots, we say cars or motorcycles, men, women, and motorcycles, who's gonna win? Well, of course the motorcycles will beat humans in a distance race, unless if they run out of gas or have a mechanical failure or something like that, And so it's just not interesting to see, for example, men compete against motorcycles in a race because it's two different categories and one is at a huge disadvantage. And it's a similar thing with age. We don't have to invoke, if the idea of men and women is too controversial, which I don't think it is anymore, but there was a time in America where that was an extremely controversial thing to say. But we could fit age. I mean, look, what if we have 10-year-olds racing versus 20-year-olds? Well, the 20-year-olds will win because their bodies are more developed, and the 10-year-olds haven't gone through that development yet, right?
Right.
And so having age categories, or in boxing, weight classes, right? Even though it's all men, they're in different weight classes, right? And why do we do that? Because super heavyweight is going to beat the crap out of a featherweight guy, right? So it's just so this idea of difficulty coming from putting a group of actors, in this case humans, in a category where it's a fair competition, because it comes from the idea that they all have essentially to some degree equal opportunity. I mean, granted, their bodies are also, people have variation in their body. You get somebody like Michael Phelps, who's like he's a human, but for all intensive purposes, his body's like a dolphin and he can swim way faster than, he won how many, like 13 gold medals or something like that. I don't know the exact number, but won a ridiculous amount of gold medals. And it seems because his body is just like almost like it's hyper adapted for swimming. And so, yeah, that guy has, a nature advantage over maybe other humans. But still, we basically put, people together because the idea is it becomes about who trains or practices the hardest in order to win. And it's the same thing with performers. The idea that, the winning comes from the fact of them improving their own craft in a way that an AI being trained to beat people in chess is a different thing. It's a different category, right? And so I don't know if that makes sense, but I think that that's where I think that we don't have to invoke any new understanding of what competition is in order to exclude, non-humans from competition, right?
Makes sense.
And it's a similar thing. We could have category competition with AIs where the constraint is, okay, you have to fit the AI within a certain amount of RAM on a PCB, right? And, is that going to beat so who can make the best AI that fits within some certain constraint, right? Or an AI that runs on, say we pick an FPGA chip or something, and you have to be able to fit the AI on that chip in order to have it win at chess and then have those play each other. versus an AI that lives in a data center with an access to a bazillion GPUs, right? I mean, that's going to have an unfair advantage over a hardware-constrained AI. So there's perhaps within the AI categories, there's various kinds of competition we could have as well.
Yeah. It makes sense. What would be... okay, sorry.
Go ahead.
So I'll ask you now about like advice to entrepreneurs. So yeah. Okay. Johnny, right?
Yes, Johnny. That's
Johnny.
me. Yep.
Okay. Johnny, what would be your advice to people, to newcomers to Tokyo, or just to people who want to start their businesses on basically what to focus on and what to do, kind of, how to develop their network, how to do their research, how to mitigate risks, etc. And overall, like, what would be the best way to execute a plan?
Sure. Well, I would firstly say, think long and hard if Tokyo is where you really want to do your business. I would firstly say, the place matters because it's going to dictate your access to capital. And I think that I think the smart way to start a business is to look at, if you're doing a startup and you're looking at growing, you need to think about how you're going to have money to sustain the business. Now, one way to do it is to bootstrap it, where you have a certain amount of cash that you start with, certain amount of cash you have in the bank account. Maybe you have a wealthy uncle or something like that, if you're lucky. You get a certain amount of cash to start, and then how do you make revenue that sustains your business, right? And if you're bootstrapping, the premise is you're not going to seek capital, but you're going to basically generate revenue basically from day one, and then you're going to feed that back into the business to continue to invest and grow. Maybe you're going to hire some people at some point, or you have to fund your running cost of your servers and your product or whatever you're paying for. So, how do you sustain that? So is it sustained by your own revenue? The alternative is you go out and raise a larger chunk of money, let's say a seed round of $1 million or something like that. And so you have to think, okay, you have to have an idea, first of all, that you're going to have to convince people to give you money for, right? You have to convince people to invest. It doesn't just magically fall out of the sky. And then, with that money, you have to ultimately plan about, how are you going to invest that money, and at what point are you going to, that gives you a certain runway, right? So let's just say for the sake of argument, my running cost, when I think about, let's say I'm doing a business where I have a certain amount of staff, I have maybe a small office or WeWork cost or whatever, I have my server running cost, maybe all in I'm paying $100K every month. When I think about, okay, I'm paying my staff a certain amount, paying my servers, whatever, blah, 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 I'm paying $100 grand a month. Well, if I raise $1 million, that means I have a 10-month runway, right? Because I'm going to be spending that much money every month. Unless if I make revenue, so if my revenue is increasing by, let's say, 10K every month, that might mean that I'm actually at break even by the time I hit the end of my runway, right? So 10 times 10, I'm now making enough revenue to sustain, I basically sustain my business within 10 months. The alternative is I could say, well, actually, this is a much longer term investment. So even after 10 months, I'm not going to be reaching break even. I'm going to be continuing to invest. I'm going to have to go out and raise more money. And that's another way to do it too, right? Is, if you can demonstrate that your business is working, then you can go out to investors and say, hey, This time around, I'm not asking for just $1 million. I'd like $10 million because I've proven that this works, and here's how we can scale, right? So I think that so that's the startup game in a nutshell, and there's two ways to play it, right? There's really only two ways. You either break even or you continually get access to capital. And you can be Jeff Bezos, for example, who just, after 10 years, he was still doing larger and larger finance rounds, and Amazon only broke even at the point where it had an absolute dominance over the whole market. And that makes sense for a business like Amazon, because in some ways breaking even is a sign that you don't really have that much more room to grow, right? I mean, if you're breaking even, the question is, why are you not going out and getting more capital and just investing that? I mean, if you're a business that fundamentally doesn't lend itself well to investment and scaling, then break even might be your only option. So in some ways, you might think that a breaking even, this is something that I try to explain to my employees. They always see anything that our business is losing money on paper as a sign that our business is failing. And it's like, well, no, it's a sign that it's succeeding, which is paradoxical, because you'd think that losing money means that you're losing. But no, losing money is a direct consequence of investing that money into growth. And so if we're breaking even, or if we're hoarding a bunch of cash, right? If we're getting a bunch of cash that's just going to our bank account or going into low risk investments or whatever it is, well, that's a sign that we don't have a business we can invest that money back into. We've exhausted our avenues for growth. We have nothing to do with that money. And that's actually much worse than investing that money into future growth, right? So, but I think that in Japan, so in Silicon Valley, investors will very much nudge you towards the growth and scaling thing. They want to see that your business has a very solid scaling story, and your seed round is just a
very beginning.
It's a POC, it's a proof of concept for demonstrating that scaling works. And then they want to be able to pump much more money into it. In fact, something investors ask for is a so-called right of first refusal, right? Which is, we will invest in you in this round on the condition that we also can invest when your thing works. We can pump more cash into you, and we can be the first one to do it at preferable investment terms, right? That's how the Silicon Valley model works.
And in Japan?
Japan, unfortunately, is very much the opposite. In fact, investors don't push for scaling, and they don't push for investing the money. They actually want, in the first or second round, they want to see you break even, and they want to see you be profitable, and then they want to see you go IPO or go public as soon as possible. And basically,
why in Japan going public is so important?
Well, it's an exit for the investors. So
that's it. They just want to.
Yeah, if you're convinced, it's a choice between a mindset of, let's take a step back and let's just imagine we have two different games. Game A is a game where we're convinced that growth is going to continue forever, and that growth is going to be almost exponential because technology is going to grow, And so this is a game where, but growth is also chaotic in the sense that that exponential growth doesn't mean that every single company will grow that way, but it will be driven by 9 out of 10 companies failing and one having astronomical returns that ultimately drives the whole market up. So it's messy, but overall growth on average, right? And so in this environment, what you want to do is you want to spray your capital across a reasonable number of good bets to make a portfolio, and then have one or two of those bets succeed, and cut your losses when the other ones are proven not to work, and get, basically, get a write-off that you can save some tax money on and stuff like that, right? Well, that's the Silicon Valley model. The Japan model is different. The fundamental assumption of the market is that growth is not going to happen. At least intrinsic fundamental growth is not going to happen because the population is not growing. In fact, the population is going to shrink by 30% over the next, I don't know if it's by 2050 or whatever it is,
Couple of decades.
Couple of decades. But it's like, well, wait a minute. How can anybody predict, the future? How can we know that the population is going to shrink? What if there's a bunch? It's like, no. We know the population is shrink. Why? We know exactly how many Japanese 20-year-olds there will be in 20 years because we know how many babies were born this year. And there's not going to be more, for example, or, last year, let's say, 21-year-olds, babies born last year. The total number of those babies, which we know.
That it's impossible, to have more babies.
We can't have more babies born last year. That means we can't have more 20-year-olds in 20 years, it's not a theory, right? It's clearly the numbers, like Shakira says, the hips don't lie. It's the same thing. So in this environment, one where we're looking at shrinking, right? Not an overall assumption of growth, but of actually population shrinkage, and then the market becomes a zero-sum game, right? So it's a question between a non-zero-sum game versus a zero-sum game. What's a non-zero-sum game? It means you and I can play a game and we can both win. So if you and I both start with one, I have whatever we're trading, one thing, you have one thing, we collaborate. In the end of the game, you can end up with 2 and I can end up with 3, or I can end up with 4, you can end up with 3, whatever. We can end up with more than we started, right, by trading. So for example, if you think about farming, right? Farming is a non-zero-sum game because we can end up with more things than we started with, right?
So then stock market would be a zero-sum game because somebody loses, somebody...
Well, no.
No?
Not necessarily, because new companies are being formed all the time. New people are being born. Those people grow up. They start companies. Those companies find new ways of, they make new things like AI, which didn't exist before, right? Or at least not in its current form, right? Or they make a new product that everybody loves. They make an iPhone that, who knew that we would be listening to music and taking pictures and recording podcasts with our phone, right? Because when I was a kid, phones were something you called people with. We didn't if somebody said, oh yeah, take a picture with your phone, I'd be like, what? This is a phone. You're thinking of a camera. It's like, no, use your phone, right? So there's new innovations all the time, and those innovations are disruptive. Yes, they displace old innovations, but they also enable fundamental new. I mean, if you think about how much economic and productivity has been unlocked because of the innovations in the last 100 years, or the last 150 years before there were cars or airplanes, it's like, because those innovations exist, they unlock new modes of productivity, right? Because cars exist, we can now ship goods, right? Amazon and the ability to just literally get any good you want delivered to your doorstep would not have happened had we not invented the internal combustion engine or something equivalent to it, right? The automobile, right? And the airplane. And so because of these innovations are always happening, it's a non-zero-sum game in the stock market. And human economic growth is viewed that way overall. But as soon as we start to view it as a zero-sum game, that is a game where you and I, for example, suppose we're playing poker, well, that's a zero-sum game because you and I are never going to end up with more than the total amount of chips that we started with, assuming
somebody
that,
should
assuming
win
that
and somebody
our
should
rich
lose.
uncle doesn't buy-in or something like that. But assuming there's no external source, right, that's a zero-sum game. And then the economics of zero-sum games are much different than non-zero-sum games, right? Because in a zero-sum game, all of a sudden it becomes not about thinking about long-term growth and willing to take short-term losses in order to win long-term. The best strategy in a zero-sum game is, as soon as I can grab your thing and make it mine and run for the hills, get out once I have money, then I should, right? As soon as I have a winner, I should immediately cut my losses, or I should immediately lock that in, and not, because future growth is bounded, right? Because the amount of growth that ultimately is going to happen in the system, we know that that's going down.
So you mean that American VCs, they see the game as non-zero sum game?
A long-term non-zero-sum game.
And in Japan, it's the opposite. They see the businesses as zero-sum game, the market.
Well, think about it.
Zero-sum game, basically.
Think about it, right? Suppose that the total value of the market is increasing, right? Is fundamentally increasing. Then if I invest in a company and its value goes up, how should I read that? I should read that as, it's not a deviation from what the whole market is doing. In fact, if my company that I invested in, let's say I invest in a new startup, Fubar Co., right? And my investment starts to win, I should view that as, I may have a real winner. And this might be the company that, the reason why the market is going up is because there's certain companies that are losing, but certain companies are actually going up at a much steeper rate. So like Anthropic, for example, or SpaceX, right? These companies are increasing in value actually at a much greater rate than the market. So if I have a company that's going up in value that I'm invested in, I should actually pump more capital. I should go to the founders and say, hey, how can I get more money into your company? I want to put as much money as I can because you guys are showing clear signs of being a winner. And I want to capture, I think your growth is going to be, your growth is clearly part of the overall market story of driving it up, right? So that's the non-zero sum overall market growing view. Okay, now let's say that the market is decreasing overall, and I am invested in a company that has gone up. Well, what does that mean?
That means that the company has like a cap when it will not go up more?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one way you could read it. I mean, it means intrinsically that growth is a fluke. It's a local anomaly that is not in line with the overall market trend.
So you mean that in growing market, the growing company would be just normal market trend, and in decreasing market, degrading market, if you grow, it's like abnormal and you are an outlier and it's like expected to be unsustainable, or what's the reason?
Yeah, I mean, more or less that's the idea. And so if I invested in that company that went up, what should I be thinking? Should I be thinking about putting more money into it? Well, no, because on average it's probably going to go down, or its growth at least will be bounded. What I should do is just focus on getting my money out. And how do I do that? Well, I tell that company, hey, but don't worry, I'm not going to put more money into you, don't worry about your future growth. Instead, let's just talk about how you become profitable, right? So, don't worry about getting a lot more money and investing it in.
It's almost depressing how they see business here.
Well, I'm generalizing. But I think that this framework is more or less what I've observed in the fact that so many of the VCs are pushing for profitability in IPO rather than willing to be fundamentally think about long-term games, and even games outside of Japan, for example. I mean, we have a real growth story in emerging markets, in Thailand,
India?
and Indonesia, and India, yes, and our business is going quite well. but it's been hard as a Japanese company to really attract outside capital to really attack those markets to the degree that we could be doing. So I think that, I'm not bitter about it, but I would just be realistic and say, you need to be aware of what the overall market pressures are. And that's why if you're founding a business in either a developed economy that has a very strong VC infrastructure, or alternatively an emerging market where the VC infrastructure might not be as developed, but there's also investors like Sequoia, or there are developed investors who want to play in those emerging markets because, again, why are they interested in emerging markets? Because the overall growth story, right? And population's growing. Population growing is one of the key reasons. I mean, look at India. The population is growing. It's one of the world's youngest populations. So not only is it growing, the problem with Japan is it's not only shrinking, it's aging. And when it's aging, when the average age goes up, that means the portion of people in society who are not productive and need to be supported rather than net contributing also is increasing, right? And so, and China to some degree is now, it's kind of come out that China was thought to be going to be growing infinitely. Well, actually China's population is now shrinking too, right? And aging as well. So India has the opposite. It's one of the world's youngest population, and the younger generations are getting wealthier, and they're very consumer oriented, right? So they actually want to go out and spend their money on experiences or products or whatever it is, right?
But like still, the population, it cannot grow like all the time. It's the idea of ever-growing population and ever-growing market is by itself probably unsustainable because it's not really
yes,
possible.
but it's a question of how far, we draw the line out into the future. I mean, yes, in some ways, if we look at, for example, probably the countries that are projected to have ultimately the largest growth, the longest term growth in population is Africa. But Africa is probably in many cases, underdeveloped to be, really suitable as an investment. I mean, I invest actually in some African companies today, but there's a lot of, at some point the further I think you go in the developmental ladder, you come into fundamental corruption and, even in developing countries, look at Indonesia, for example. It's, that's now jailing. They had the brightest entrepreneur, sort of the Elon Musk of Indonesia, named Nadiem Makarim, was arrested and jailed because he joined government, and they tried to reform government, and the people.
So he was jailed because government didn't like him?
Yeah, he joined as an education minister, and he tried to reform the education system there. But in the process, he rubbed a lot of people the wrong way because, he tried to digitize education, right?
Yeah, which decreases normally corruption and...
Well, yeah, absolutely. The fact that not just the kids' education was now being done on laptops, but also the schools' purchasing systems were all digitized. And what does that do? It means if you're if you're the headmaster of some school in some remote island, you can no longer use the school's budget as your own slush fund, right? And so, so there was all sorts of things that digitization. The government came after him over completely fake charges, and that's just an example. But
when did it happen? Very recently.
He's on trial right now.
Right now.
Yeah, and that's just an example. But I think that any tech investor who's thinking of putting money into Indonesia should look long and hard about the fact that the country's literally jailing its best and brightest, you know. He had the most valuable company in Indonesia, right? He founded Gojek, which is the Uber of Indonesia. Yeah. And he had the most valuable company. And he left that company. He exited. And actually, he lost a ton of money to join government because the share value collapsed when he left. And he joined government with the point of helping the children. Like, this is not a guy who needs to gain a few extra pennies through corruption or corrupt contracts. Like, it's a ridiculous accusation. Yeah, he basically, you know, he actually left office, and, you know, a year later there was these BS allegations against him, and he said, look, I joined government, I left my company, I joined government to help the country. I'm a patriot. I'm not going to leave my country. You know, if you want to put me on trial, do it. So he's been on trial for the last 8 months. I think they'll deliver a sentence soon. But a lot of people are watching this trial because it really is a big question about what the direction of the country is. I mean, is it going to be a country that embraces reform and technology, even if that means that some people's little corrupt schemes will go away, which is what happens with digitization? Or is it one where they say, nah, F it, you know, we don't want technology here. So, you know, and we're gonna jail anyone who tries to bring about those reforms. So I don't know. I think every country, just to kind of connect this back to the conversation, I think every country has to look fundamentally at what it's doing, right? And making token investments, like picking some random AI, somebody who in your country who started an AI company, and then just giving them some money from the government.
Just because it's AI? Because
you have AI in your name. That's not what creates the next Anthropic, right? What creates the next Anthropic or OpenAI or
SpaceX.
Yeah, we can name any, you know, next Amazon, next Stripe, next Apple. It's an intentional posture of creating an ecosystem that has a high tolerance for risk and ultimately a high acceptance of failure. Is willing to fail, but is also willing to succeed big, and creating an ecosystem where there's an overall growth mindset. And I think my view is that growth mindset becomes self-sustaining, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy if you can get it off the ground, because it's a feedback loop, right? So if Silicon Valley, if your first wave of entrepreneurs, 9 out of 10 of them fail, but 1 out of 10 succeed, they create big companies that demonstrate success that will attract more investment appetite and more capital, to the point where now, you know, investing your money in the next wave of Silicon Valley companies, at least giving your money to a VC who's savvy about the ecosystem and making the right investments. You can't just maybe blindly pick companies, but that's the VC's job, is, you know, they're kind of picking the winners or losers, but they're doing it based on an actual investigation, right? Each of those companies is pitching to the VCs, and the VCs are making a judgment about whether or not the companies will fail or succeed. So they're making an informed decision. So it's not like you can just show up there with a sign saying, you know, give me $1 million seed round, you know, and people
just because.
Actually, that would be fun. If I was ever homeless in San Francisco, I think that's exactly the sign I would make. Please fund my $1 million seed round.
Did it work?
I don't know. I'll do that next time. That would be fun. I'll let my beard grow out a little bit, and sit there on the street corner outside Andreessen Horowitz or wherever.
Maybe if you put their AI, maybe it will work better.
That's right. Yeah, have AI startup please give a little cup out. Please give $100 million seed round. That's what it feels like some days is going on there. But no, yeah, you know, I think that ultimately it can't just be performative, right? It can't just be a performative investment saying, okay, yes, we have some country cool AI fund and we're going to invest $1 million in this AI, you know, this company that has AI in its name. It's like, no, that doesn't count. That's just pissing away money. What needs to be done is a fundamental rethink from the ground up about how you're going to win the long-term game and ultimately how you move from a zero-sum game climate to a you know, finite game climate, to use Carson's wording, right? A finite game to an infinite game, right? To a long, you know, Naval Ravikant says, play long-term games with long-term people. How do we move to a long-term game mindset? I think in Japan, the question is, as a country, you know, how does that happen? And Japan has been there before, right? I mean, if you look at the post-war era, it was not viewed as a zero-sum game, right? It was clearly viewed, you know, after Japan went through the national, you could call it, tragedy of, you know, losing the war, and, you know, the expectation from the average Japanese person after World War II is that America was going to come in and kill everybody, right? And completely destroy the country, because that's what the emperor had said, that, you know, that was the propaganda, that if Japan loses, you know, America invades, you know, everyone has to fight to the death because Japan, you know, America is going to kill every man, woman, and child anyway. And lo and behold, America came in and the war was over, and they said, okay, well, how do we rebuild, you know? And we don't want to dominate this country forever. Our goal is to get it on the right track, get it to a point where, you
it's
know,
our strong ally, rather.
Yeah, we want an ally, and we don't want to. Yeah, we don't want to own the country, and we want it to become a successful thing. And it was the biggest post-war success story, right? But that happened entirely because because Japan and the average Japanese person had a mindset of growth. Had a mind. You know, you wouldn't have gotten companies like Sony, right, or Toyota, right? You
even Japan Rail, probably.
Yeah. Japan Rail's maybe a different, you know, Japan Rail doesn't export outside of Japan, but you wouldn't have got these companies that became the biggest in the world, right? You wouldn't have gotten the Walkman if you didn't have an idea of growth and innovation and disruptive innovation and willing to take risks and make those investments to make those things happen. If the view was, oh, it's a zero-sum game, why bother, you know? Or we'll make a Walkman, but it will just be for the Japanese market, and we're going to get, you know, our goal is basically get a government grant, you know, and we don't even have to make a product, doesn't have to actually work, which is what I feel a lot of the Japanese AI startups are doing. Then the Walkman as we know it, right? The international success, the transistor, you know, based, you know, music playing device, would not have existed, right? And that happened in so many different industries in Japan throughout the post-war period, right? That if you look at movies like Back to the Future, American movies, you know, the presumption, or Blade Runner, or any of these movies that were made in the 80s, the presumption was just, it's very clear that Japan is just going to take over the whole world because we can draw a straight line from the amount of innovation and success they've had. And it's taking that innovation and applying Japanese quality standards. You asked about stability.
Right.
Why did Japanese cars succeed? Is it because they're faster, or they're
They're more reliable.
They're more reliable. That's entirely why American consumers love Japanese cars, because you just didn't have to deal with all the bullshit of breaking down and taking it to a local mechanic, right? And that reliability is a consumer expectation. It's a consumer requirement to launch it in Japan, right? And that same bar, and in America, it's a nice to have. It's nice to have a car that doesn't break down, but in Japan, it's a requirement that it be well engineered, right? And I think the same is true of software. And you also have to be willing. But you look at the post-war period, it's clearly the case that you can have the innovation and the stability itself, because the stability should just be viewed as another innovation, right? Japan's stability wasn't an accident. It was deliberate engineering, and it required tons of engineering brain cells and innovative ideas to achieve that stability and to build an engine with the fewest moving parts and with the optimal tolerances and et cetera, that it just never breaks down. And so I think all this stuff is possible to do. And in fact, you look at the older Japanese generation, right? The generation, the baby boomer even before that, really the generation that experienced the war when they were children, right? And then came of age during the time when it was time to rebuild, and it was time to build, came to age in the 60s or late 50s, 60s, right? That generation has a completely different attitude of risk than the current generation does, right? Completely different, because the current generation, again, in the zero-sum mindset, what's the goal? The goal is to join a big company and get lifetime employment, right? Well,
still, yeah.
Well, was that the goal in 1960? No, because big companies didn't exist. And lifetime employment, forget it. The country had just been destroyed 10 years earlier, right? I mean, you start to think lifetime employment is like, well, gee, that would be nice if our country didn't, completely implode. Yeah, and so I think in some ways, this kind of ties back to Ukraine, that actually being in a very chaotic environment, such as what a war brings about, actually creates the seeds of innovation, because you no longer you're pushed out of your comfort zone, for better or for worse, right? When Russia invaded Ukraine, that pushed every Ukrainian out of their day-to-day comfort zone. In fact, we have a guy at Table Check who's in Ukraine, right, and has his own generator, and so he can get electricity,
right? Yep.
And he has Starlink satellite to get internet, right? He has every excuse not to work. And I even told him, firstly, I said, join the Cyber Corps if you want, and go try to hack Putin. He said, I tried, they didn't take me. So okay, he said, just let me work, and he has every excuse to not work. But he's an industrious guy, and he said, okay, what do I need? I need electricity, I need internet. So he made all those things happen, right? So, and he won an award, he won multiple, company awards of just, the company MVP of just, what a tremendous effort this guy made. And he's actually, not just doing that, but he's actually one of our top performers. And I don't think that's an accident, right? I think that if you're of course he would, because if you're willing to find a way to make it work in a war zone, then you can really achieve anything, right? And so I think that, look, this is not an argument for every country going into a war to spur entrepreneurship. Of course, that's not what I'm saying. But I think that fundamentally, the recognition that stability, I think in Japan, this idea of risk aversion and stability, and that our goal is to be so stable that, there's not a car coming for a mile, but people won't won't cross the street at a, won't
Red
cross an
light.
alley street at a red light, even though we know that's just one silly example. And I think that's more of a Tokyo thing. I think in Osaka they don't do that as much. But,
Yeah.
that the goal of life is to eliminate all risk. Well, if you make that your goal, then you miss out on so much opportunity and smart risks and smart bets you could do that do come with some risk. Because everything, I think, first of all, it's a fallacy to think that everything you do in life is a risk, including not taking a risk. That's actually has risk implicit with it as well.
Itself, yeah.
And in fact, inaction in some ways is the biggest risk. Because not only do you not gain anything, but the rest of the world moves ahead and you don't learn anything as a result.
So you sort of like, instead of having a chance of achieving something, you are just doomed to not achieve anything if you are...
You just stay the same,
Yeah.
but staying the same in a world that is rapidly evolving is probably a bad move, right? I mean, because even though you're the same and the rest of the world is moving forward, that just makes you outdated.
Yeah.
Just makes you stagnant, right?
So there isn't like the state of stability. You either you progress or you degrade, basically.
Well, you degrade relative to everyone else because everyone else is going to be moving forward, right? And so I think that's the biggest. I think that's the biggest implicit thing here that people need to realize. So, the idea of lifetime employment, right? Joining the biggest company you can find that doesn't really have much growth potential, really, because it's already maxed out its growth, right? I mean, they can still grow, but is it going to have hyper growth potential like a startup? No. Is Mitsubishi all of a sudden going to go up in value, 5 times next year? No. Is Anthropic? Maybe. Yeah. So, and is there a Silicon Valley startup that might go up 20 times in value or 100 times in value? Yeah, I'm sure there is one. Now, are there also ones that will just go to zero? Yeah. But we had, for example, our third employee who joined our company. So as my founder, our first employee besides the 2 founders, right? So it was my co-founder, myself, and then first guy who joined was a childhood friend of my co-founder. And he worked at a big Japanese trading company, Sojitsu. And stable lifetime employment. And he left that job to join to join TableCheck. And he told his mother, I'm joining a startup, it's so exciting. And she cried and she said, why would you throw your life away? You had this wonderful stable job at Sojitsu. Why would you, big Japanese trading company, why would you join a startup and throw your life away? And it's just like, that's the wrong mindset fundamentally. I think in America, a mother would, especially at a young age, right? Because this guy was in his 20s, and we were all in our 20s at the time. It's like it's totally the perfect time to join a startup. If you're 65, maybe stable employment's a smart move because, if your company goes bankrupt, maybe it might be hard to find another job. It depends on the person. But you're 20, 27.
You've got nothing to lose, basically.
Yeah. You should really view it that way. That, but what do you gain even if it fails? That's the bigger question. You gain valuable experience. And you can go on to the next thing. And he ultimately left our company but joined another startup that was quite successful, and it worked out for him. So I think that's the big thing, that I think that there needs to be a cultural there needs to be some rethinking. There needs to be some realignment here. And I think the country needs to look at the implications of how it's operating today and where that ultimately leads. And I think that that's something that, if your original question is, if you're an outsider, if you're not from Japan like me, and you want to start a company here, I think you should accept that that's the reality of where Japan is today, and it's going to be very difficult for you to change it, right? Because as a founder, you can't, just like if I go to Silicon Valley, I can't, there's flaws with the way Silicon Valley works. People shouldn't think that I'm saying it's a perfect system. And if I go to start up a company in Silicon Valley, I'm going to be beholden to the way that game works, warts and all. If I go to Israel and start a company, I'm going to be beholden to the idiosyncrasies of the Israeli system and the good things and bad things about that, or Estonia, or wherever I go, right? And so I think that's the biggest advice I'd have is, firstly focus on what are you doing fundamentally, how are you going to sustain it with revenue. If your plan is to raise capital, which is what I did, and is not a bad move to do at all, especially if your goal is to make a hyper growth company, then you need to think about how you're going to get access to that capital. You need to think about what your idea is. Is it attractive to investors? For example, starting a SaaS business in 2026 without an AI story.
Not the best idea.
Not a bad. Not a good idea. Not the best idea. Yeah, because investors are convinced right now that SaaS is dead. That's TableCheck, right? They're convinced that a company like TableCheck should be valued much lower than, for example, what it was valued 10 years ago. Because there was a thinking 10 years ago, okay, SaaS is going to take over the world, but now it's like, well, AI is going to crush SaaS because everyone's going to be able just to make their own personal TableCheck. I think that's a bit absurd. Maybe there's some truth to it, but I think that ultimately there'll be some recognition that it's not so much about the software, but it's probably more about the data that matters. And so I think there's an overreaction to thinking that just because you can clone some software with Claude code and make a flimsy, non-stable, non-production ready clone that you can run on your own machine. And look, maybe Claude code will get to the point where Claude's already a very good SRE, so maybe, an infrastructure engineer, so maybe in a year it would be entirely possible to press a button on Claude or whatever service and you get a full stack that's actually highly stable and highly well tested and blah blah blah. Doesn't feel like we're there right now, but in a year's time, in 2 years, will that be possible? It might be, but I think you still need to ask. One of the things is for example, I had a client who messaged me around midnight 2 days ago saying, hey, can you guys give us, we want access to an MCP server. And I said, well, look, we have an API, TableCheck MCP server. And I said, well, and it's a restaurant, right, wanting access to an MCP server. Well, we have an API you can connect to. MCP, not hard to build at all. We could crank it out in a day or two. We haven't done it yet, but because no one's really asked for it. But why do you want an MCP server? And he's like, well, I want our restaurant managers to use Claude code to dynamically adjust our menu item prices, to do dynamic pricing with our menu items. And I'm like, wait a minute, think about what you're saying here. You're expecting that all your restaurant managers will now become vibe coders on Claude code and then dynamically adjust the menu item prices. And you don't see any way that this could possibly go wrong. And it's like, I'm not saying that those kind of AI doesn't ultimately unlock some of those stories, but we have to also think, is every restaurant manager now going to be an engineer? And even if every restaurant manager can build their own TableCheck, you're a restaurant group, this guy has 30 restaurants in his group. You want to have 30 different TableChecks that is each engineered by each of your restaurant managers? And it's like, well, okay, maybe, okay. Well then, and then it becomes, well, no, we don't want that. We want to have a centralized one. Okay, so now you want a central engineering team that builds for this for you. Okay, so now you want to hire engineers that you have to pay to run your AI vibe coded thing and deal with the issues and stuff like that. Okay, let's just say it's, just want one engineer for all 30 restaurants. Okay, let's say that's the case, that you just can achieve, because Claude is so good, you can just have one engineer doing that. Okay, you're paying this guy's salary, and what does table check cost? Table check costs, less than $200 a month per restaurant, right? And so you have 30 restaurants, you're paying $60,000 a month. You're going to pay more in this guy's salary to maintain your own custom vibe coded version of table check that doesn't do everything that table check does. And you're not going to just pay one guy. In reality, you're going to pay a lot more. You're going to pay with incidents and all the other problems you're going to have. And then you're going to pay for infrastructure to run it. And you're going to pay the AI costs too.
And you're going to have the risk that something goes wrong.
And you don't have any data security guarantee or anything like that. So it's like, I think there was some meme. It's like, I'm paying Anthropic this much, and I'm paying this much in GPUs, and this much, and this, and this tool, in order to replicate a $20 SaaS service.
Yeah,
and it's like, okay, so, and look, you're never, the fundamental thing is going to be the human salary until the point where there's a SaaS service that is so good that it replaces that human who knows what your restaurants need and then makes the software for you. But then I don't know that can be done. I think that at some point you're going to end up hiring someone to do that for you. Because until the point where it's so good that you don't even need restaurant managers anymore, because everything is just robot overlords and all your staff are just gig economy people that are coordinated by the overlord AI. I just don't think that we're anywhere, we're just, given the reality of the way things are today, we're just nowhere near that. Will that be the case in 20 years? Maybe. Maybe by that time we'll all have Neuralink interfaces that, the cloud is synced with our brain and blah, blah, blah. And, we're all existing in a virtual metaverse. Sure, but if that's our thesis, why invest in anything today? Because it's so radically different, then, you need to jump through so many disruption hula hoops to get to that point that, I don't see that. Look, I'm not a SaaS fanboy or SaaS, apologist here. I'm just a guy who's running a SaaS business, like looking at the reality of, look, if I was doing legal document drafting, for example, I would be very concerned that could be entirely replaced by AI. Now, those companies actually people still want plausible deniability, and they still want a human lawyer to sign off on things. So even then, you can't fully get rid of in some ways, humans will be needed for nothing else to be a neck to squeeze, right? When something goes wrong, because it will never be acceptable that, the reality is, suppose, lawyers make a mistake, human lawyers make a mistake 1% of the time. 1% of contracts they make a mistake. It's probably much higher than that. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, 1% of 1% of clauses or whatever, lawyers make some mistake. Well, an AI makes a mistake 0.1% of the time. But as soon as it's an AI doing it, it's inexcusable. And if it was a human lawyer doing it, it would be much more excused. Same with self-driving cars, right? People are terrible drivers. They get in traffic accidents, kill themselves all the time. But as soon as it's an AI killing someone, as soon as it's a self-driving car, then we can't accept that, because and we can't accept it on multiple levels, one is, oh, this technology is so unsafe. Well, it's far safer than humans driving.
Yeah.
It's demonstrably safer, probably by a factor of 1 to 10, right? But then there's also just ethically, we have nobody to blame. You can't just go and maybe it's an open
Squeeze
thing.
the neck of somebody.
Well, whether or not we can jail Elon Musk because one of his cars has a defect and killed some kid, right? And we're not, as humans, we're not able to think in terms of statistics. We're just not able to do that. Otherwise, so many of our political problems would be solved. The problem with the general purpose AI, similar to a self-driving car, is that it is expected to make a much broader scope of decisions. And with those decisions, just by the fact that the scope is broader than before. So for example, if you look at a car that has cruise control, right? It just basically keeps your speed constant, right? So you can take your foot off the pedal. Well, that's a form of automation, but it's very narrowly scoped automation, right? And so fundamentally, the human is still viewed as responsible. Like you can't go to an officer and say, why were you speeding? Why did you hit this person? Oh, because the car was in cruise control. It's like, well, no, you put it in cruise control at a certain speed. If I put my car in cruise control at 100 miles per hour on the freeway and I get pulled over, I can't say, oh, the car did it. It's like, well, technically the car did it, but I made the car do it, and it was a direct consequence of my decision, right? So the scope of that kind of automation is narrower. Same with SaaS. I mean, you're entrusting a very defined scope. And we have a very defined terms of use about what our product does and what it doesn't do. So for example, if someone comes to the restaurant and let's say that they get served some food that has, they have an allergy, right? Let's say they're allergic to, milk, and there's dairy and, that gets served to them. Our product is very clear that, the operator, we support an allergy field, but we're very clear that it has this defined, you have to input that here, or you have to capture it somehow, and then here's where it's displayed to you. Versus a much broader scope, AI general purpose system that does everything, just tells your servers exactly what to do. Well, the more layers of abstraction and the more you broaden the scope and the less specific you are about how those decisions are made, if it's just like thinking, okay, here's your food. Well, at that point, you lose traceability and you lose the ability to attribute that mistake to a specific component or system. And so whose fault is that? Is that now Sam Altman's fault because the AI is flawed? Is it, or is it the restaurant owner's fault for using AI? And are they then, as soon as that sort of situation happens, and AI makes mistakes all the time. It says, running Claude code with, bypass permissions on. Oops, I deleted your hard drive. Let me try to fix it. Oh, I can't. How often have we seen that? And it only takes one major one major mistake to really cause people to lose trust in that system. And so, and I think that, there's maybe a degree of tolerance where US consumers are more willing to trust or willing to tolerate mistakes more than Japanese consumers. But I still don't think that we get away from, the structure that a SaaS system provides. And what does that provide? Well, first of all, table check. This day and age, if I'm opening up a new restaurant, well, I would choose table check, not because just it's a great, reliable product and I know exactly what it does, but also I can hire staff who've used it before.
Oh.
Yeah, there's 14,000 restaurants. So if you're a Michelin restaurant, odds, and you're hiring a server you want to hire someone who's worked at a restaurant before, you don't want to hire a bunch of newbies. And they'll immediately know the system. Or they'll use a competitor system that for all intents and purposes is very similar and it's a low learning curve to learn, but they're learning, something basically, it's not a complete, it's like, so there's a bunch of advantages to having structure and defining that. And when we build an application, we're actually thinking a lot about how that structure should be. We also think about where do we need to improve or disrupt or, hopefully not disrupt our actual client operations, but ultimately innovate a new structure that they can then migrate to. And we think about the upgrade and training path for the clients. And is AI going to magically solve this for you? I mean, it might if you come up with a thing where humans don't even need the system and the AI literally tells people exactly what to do. Like that's maybe one universe. That's one path we could go in all of this is, we don't need SaaS because we don't need any structured system because the AI will just tell us in the most basic thing, it will just say, Vitaly, go to table 3, give them this exact food. And you're like, I don't even know the customers, I don't know the customers, I don't know anything. Doesn't matter because you just are a human robot who just follows the basic instructions. And in some way, that's kind of what, Uber and gig economy systems have reduced things to is go to this, pick up food from here, deliver it to here. Go to this address, pick up customer, drive them here, right? And so maybe that's the level of interface that all systems will have with humans. And so maybe a system like table check is actually causing too much brain power to be used today because you actually have to look at a floor map of your tables and you have to look at the customer and you have to look at their visit history and see what they complained about last time. And maybe the system will just say, go to table 3 and apologize for the beef that was undercooked last time, and you go, what, really, there was? And it goes, yes, there was beef that was undercooked. Don't care about it, just go, right? And so maybe that's what, maybe that's what AI is like. And so, it basically removes all human understanding or situational awareness, or essentially what we humans have adapted for millennia to do. Right? And it just says, literally do this thing. Why am I doing this? Because the AI says so. Maybe that's where the systems are going. I don't know. There's brighter people than me in Silicon Valley who have an idea of what that might look like, but maybe that's what the future of restaurant service is. I don't think that's particularly good because I like to go to a restaurant, and if it's a restaurant I like to know the staff there and know my server, and I like to have them know me, and I like to have a conversation with,
with a human being.
With a human being, and I like to, and our whole premise, and maybe our premise is flawed, right? But the premise of the OTAs is, it doesn't matter who the customers are because they're all anonymous. They're just people who, they go, they fill your seats.
They're just units.
They leave. They're units. We will give you seat filling units and they will pay you monetary units, and our premise is no, there should be a direct connection, right? That the best experiences that people want to have, both from terms of the people who visit the restaurants, but also the people who work with restaurants, come from human connections. And that the technology should facilitate those human connections. And we shouldn't be faceless, anonymous units, but we should be people who we know and we make a connection with in our lives, right? The kind of Japanese, ichigo, ichie, the emphasis on human connection is something that's is in and of itself valuable and should be developed and fostered and encouraged, right? So that's what I think that we're premised on. And is that ultimately the best way to make money? It's probably not. It's probably not the best business model, to be honest, because human connections and those kind of experiences might not be as scalable as fast as assigning everybody an anonymous number and saying, you unit 1395, go to address, here, go to address A and pick up food, and then go to address B and deposit the food to the receptacle human unit, and it's like, if that's what if that's what AI is,
Receptacle.
if that's what AI is ultimately getting us to, then it's like, I think there's going to be, at some point, where do we draw the line of like, okay, this is not this is not what we want. Like, it's just not what I want from I don't want to be treated as a food receptacle when I go to a Michelin restaurant.
But it is, I understand it, but the thing you described, it's sort of the future you would like. But do you think that we are sort of more likely to end up with basically being treated as food receptacles, or we have?
I think McDonald's, if you look at McDonald's, I think people already basically are food receptacles, and so, when you look at automation in fast food, it will probably happen. And, will the McDonald's experience be fundamentally degraded if the human servers are replaced by robots? I mean, probably not. If anything, it will probably be improved, just given the fact that, at least in America, Japan's a little different, but in America, McDonald's, I mean, if you've ever been to a McDonald's when the cash register is out, you're in for a big treat, because many of the people don't know, and I apologize to McDonald's employees, but not all of them, but some of them struggle to do basic math of, I'm giving you this, the burger costs, let's say the burger costs, $1.87, costs much more than that now, I'm sure, but, and then, the pennies thing is very difficult. So, I mean, I've had that experience firsthand. I don't mean to stereotype here, but, so automation in this case, where we're getting both our employees and our, the reality is employees who can't, just for the sake of argument, just being very blunt, employees who can't do math well actually cost less than employees who can do math, because employees
Correct,
who can
yeah.
do math are going to have a wider array of jobs that are open to them, and thus would consider the McDonald's salary versus potential other higher salaries they could make. So pairing humans who can't do basic math with a cash register that allows us to hire cheaper humans and at the same time operate the business is a business, is a smart business decision. So then ultimately eliminating those humans by replacing them with AI, a robot, or a kiosk. I mean, in Japan, we've had vending machines since the 80s or much longer, right? Since longer than that, vending machines since, I don't know.
I think maybe even like 60s or 70s.
Probably in the 50s. I don't know.
50s.
I don't even know when I don't know the history of vending machines, but yeah, sure. So, viewing it as an automation and cost optimization problem, if that's what the business's fundamental economics are, then yeah, sure. Let me just check my flow real quick. Yeah, okay. So, then it's very likely that further automation will occur, and that's that. And, the business model of McDonald's, I'm not going there for the human experience. I'm just not. I don't go there at all. But
You go there as food receptacle.
as a food receptacle, yes, to fill my food meter, right? Now, going to a Michelin restaurant, firstly, there's many things they could do right now if their concern was cost optimization. They could use cheaper ingredients. They could have a worse atmosphere. They don't need to invest in atmosphere. I mean, there's many things they could do to cut costs. The point is that they're not cutting costs within at least their as soon as you go to a Michelin restaurant and you have the impression that they're cutting costs, it's a big problem, right?
Right.
So, so in that sense, that automation should be seen as something that enhances the customer experience, but it shouldn't be seen as something that, it's failing if it automates, if it saves time, but while degrading the experience.
Johnny, what is the best piece of advice you have ever received in your life?
The best piece of advice, in my life. I'm trying to think. You can fool some people sometimes, but you can't fool all the people all the time. I don't know. That's a tough one. It's hard to think of the best piece of advice in my life. I mean, on some level, I would say it comes down to when there's chaos, look for opportunity. Change is inevitable. Change can be painful, but it's necessary. And there's certain things you can control in your life, and there's other things that you can't control, and there's no point in getting too stressed out about the things you can't control. I think that one of the things I really like is the idea of sort of good, bad, who knows. When any external change happens, like for example, when I was laid off from my job at Nomura is doing stock trading. I at the time thought of my initial reaction was to be very, very negative about it. But then I ultimately opened up to the possibility of everything else I could be doing besides stock trading, and the fact that I'd always wanted to found my own company. And my life went down a radically different path at that point. But I'm very grateful that ultimately that happened. And I think that what I saw as a very negative event at that time turned out to be a very good thing ultimately for me. And my life wouldn't be where it is today had I not been kicked out of the nest. And so I say that to everyone is, I think the initial reaction towards any kind of change or any kind of disruption is one of fear and worry and seeing it as a negative thing because it disrupts your current conception of reality. But if you can realign your reality and you can look for the opportunities, then you can ultimately turn it into something very positive. So that's what I would say.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
this was
yes.
Johnny Schild.
Yeah.
And thank you for being here. Thank you for your time. If you found this valuable, please subscribe, press like, stay tuned.
Subscribe, like and subscribe.
Thank you.